Have you ever noticed how resentment feels like carrying a heavy chain around your heart? It doesn't matter if the event happened yesterday, last year, or even decades ago. When we recall the pain, it's as if the wound is still fresh. We tell ourselves that holding on to anger will protect us, that it keeps us strong, but in truth, it keeps us trapped. Imagine this. Someone once wronged you deeply. Maybe they betrayed your trust, insulted you, or left you feeling abandoned. Each time you think about it, you relive the pain. And slowly, without realizing it, you become a prisoner of your own memory. The other person might have moved on, forgotten, or not even cared. But you're still carrying the weight. Resentment is like clutching a burning coal with the intention of throwing it at someone else, yet you're the one who gets burned first. This is the invisible prison most of us don't even know we're in. A prison built not of stone walls, but of anger, bitterness, and wounds that we refuse to release. Buddhism teaches that suffering arises not just from what others do to us, but from the way we cling to it afterward. We replay the story over and over in our minds, feeding the fire of hatred, telling ourselves that one day justice will balance the scale. But here's the truth. Anger doesn't heal. Hatred doesn't free us. And no amount of resentment will undo what has already been done. So why do we hold on so tightly? Because the mind whispers, if I let go, it means I've lost. If I forgive, it means they win. But forgiveness has nothing to do with them. Forgiveness is the first gift you give yourself. It is the act of breaking your own chains. Think about it. Every time you wake up with a heavy heart, every time you feel your chest tighten with old memories, every time you can't sleep because your mind replays a moment from the past, that is your life slipping away moment by moment. Forgiveness doesn't erase what happened, but it stops the bleeding. It stops you from losing your future to the pain of your past. Let me share a story. A long time ago, a monk was traveling through villages, teaching compassion. One day, a man spat on him, insulted him, and mocked his way of life. The monk simply wiped his face and walked on. His students were outraged. "Master, why didn't you punish him? Why didn't you speak up?" The monk replied gently, "He offered me anger as a gift. I chose not to accept it." That's the power of forgiveness. Not weakness, but mastery. Not surrender, but freedom. When you forgive, you are not excusing the harm, and you are not denying the pain. You are simply refusing to let the harm define you anymore. You are choosing peace over poison. Now, here's something the Buddha often reminded his followers. Life is impermanent. Everything changes. Every wound, every betrayal, every loss, it will fade just like all things fade. Why chain yourself to something that time itself is already trying to take away? This is why forgiveness matters. Not because the other person deserves it, but because you do. You deserve to breathe without the weight of chains around your chest. You deserve nights of rest that are not haunted by old shadows. You deserve mornings where your heart feels light enough to meet the day with love instead of bitterness. Resentment may feel powerful in the moment, but in the long run it only weakens us. Forgiveness, on the other hand, is the quiet strength that allows us to heal. It is the first step in opening the heart, the first step in reclaiming the freedom that anger once stole. So pause for a moment. Ask yourself, what chains am I carrying? Whose face still lingers in my mind, making my heart heavy? What pain am I still holding, long after the moment has passed? Because until we face those questions, we remain prisoners. But the moment we begin to forgive, the lock starts to turn and the door of freedom begins to open. And as we walk further, we will see even more clearly the cost of clinging to resentment and the poison it pours into our lives. Think of resentment as poison. At first, it feels justified, almost sweet. You replay the story of how someone wronged you and it gives you a strange satisfaction. You feel stronger, almost righteous. But slowly the sweetness turns bitter, and that bitterness seeps into everything. A grudge doesn't just live in your memory, it lives in your body. Notice how anger tightens the jaw, clenches the fists, makes the heart beat faster. When you hold it long enough, it becomes tension in the shoulders, headaches that never fade, sleepless nights that stretch endlessly. Modern science confirms what the Buddha taught 500 years ago. Chronic anger weakens the immune system, increases stress hormones, and shortens life itself. It's like swallowing poison every day, hoping that somehow it will hurt the other person. But the truth, the poison only flows through your own veins. And here's the most painful part. Grudges steal joy from the present moment. You could be sitting at a dinner table with friends, but one memory, one face, flashes across your mind, and suddenly your heart is no longer here. You are trapped again, reliving the past, while life quietly passes by. The Buddha compared anger to fire. If you strike a match and hold it in your palm, determined to throw it at someone, your own hand burns first. That is the cost of holding grudges. You suffer twice. Once when the harm was done, and again every time you replay it. And isn't that tragic? The original wound may have lasted seconds, but by keeping it alive in memory, we stretch it into years. Many people think that by holding on to anger, they maintain control. But really, the opposite is true. The person who harmed you may not even remember. They may be asleep peacefully at night while you lie awake, replaying every detail. In that sense, the grudge gives them power over your life, long after the moment has passed. A wise Zen master once said, "When you refuse to forgive, you are chaining yourself to the past. You give the key of your freedom to the very person who hurt you." Resentment doesn't only affect the body and mind, it affects relationships. Have you noticed how one unresolved wound can spill into everything else? Maybe you become more irritable with your children, less trusting of your partner, or less patient with colleagues. The wound doesn't stay in one corner of your heart. It spreads like ink dropped into clear water. This is the hidden cost of grudges. They don't just poison one memory, they poison the future. But here's the paradox. Even though resentment hurts us, the mind clings to it because it feels like armor. We believe if I let go, they get away with it. If I forgive, it means the pain didn't matter. But letting go does not erase the truth. Forgiveness does not mean the pain was insignificant. It means the pain is no longer in control of your life. In Buddhist teachings, suffering has two arrows. The first arrow is what happens to us, the insult, the betrayal, the loss. That arrow hurts. But the second arrow is how we respond, the story we repeat, the grudge we feed, the anger we water daily. The first arrow may be unavoidable, but the second arrow, that one is in our hands. So the real question becomes, why keep stabbing ourselves with the second arrow? If you look closely, every grudge carries a hidden thief inside. It steals peace, joy, health, and even love. And yet so many of us feed it as if it were our closest companion. We talk about our grudges. We tell stories of betrayal to anyone who will listen. We nurture the wound until it becomes part of our identity. I am the one who was wronged. But who are you really? Are you only your wound, or is there something greater waiting to emerge once you release it? The Buddha taught that anger is like a storm. It comes quickly, with thunder and lightning, but if you don't feed it, it passes. Forgiveness is the calm that follows, the sunlight that returns when the clouds finally drift away. If resentment is poison, forgiveness is the antidote, and without the antidote, the poison keeps spreading. So pause and ask yourself, what is the cost of the grudges I'm still holding? How many hours of peace, how many nights of sleep, how many smiles of joy have I already lost? And more importantly, how much more am I willing to lose? Because life is fleeting, like a drop of dew on a blade of grass. To spend it nursing anger is to waste the precious gift of being alive. And that is why forgiveness is not just important, it is urgent. For as long as we keep drinking the poison of grudges, healing cannot begin. But healing is possible, and it begins with understanding the nature of letting go, the very heart of Buddhist wisdom. If resentment is poison, then letting go is the medicine. And this medicine in Buddhism is rooted in one of the deepest truths of life. Everything is impermanent. Think about it. The seasons change, the body ages, even mountains crumble with time. Every joy, every sorrow, every moment, we cannot hold onto them no matter how tightly we grasp. Life is a river, always moving. Yet what do? We try to hold the water in our hands. We clutch at memories, cling to grudges, grasp at pain, hoping to freeze what by nature cannot be frozen. And in that clinging we suffer. The The Buddha called this clinging upadana the very fuel of suffering. It's like a flame that keeps burning because we keep adding wood. The more we hold, the more we hurt. Letting go, then, is not weakness. It is wisdom. It is understanding the true nature of things, that nothing stays, nothing belongs to us, not even our pain. Imagine carrying a heavy backpack on a long journey. At first, you convince yourself you need everything inside: old clothes, broken tools, useless stones. But as the road stretches on, your shoulders ache, your back bends, your steps slow. Then one day you set the bag down, and in that instant you realize freedom was always one choice away. Forgiveness is that choice. It is putting down the backpack of anger you've been carrying for years. But here's where the heart hesitates. If I let go, will it mean I don't care? Will it mean what happened didn't matter? No, Buddhism never asks you to deny the truth of your pain. It asks you to see it clearly, to acknowledge it fully, and then to release it, because clinging to it will not change the past. The Buddha once told a story of a woman named Kisa Gautami whose only child had died. She was overcome with grief, unable to let go. She went to the Buddha, begging him to bring the child back. The Buddha told her, "Bring me a mustard seed from a house that has never known death, and I will heal your son." Kisa Gautami went from house to house, but everywhere she went, people told her of their own losses: parents, children, friends. By the end, she understood. Death touches every home, suffering touches every heart. She buried her child and returned to the Buddha with new eyes. She had learned the wisdom of letting go. This story is not just about death. It's about every kind of loss, every kind of pain. The world is full of wounds, but clinging to them does not heal them. Only letting go can. In modern life, letting go may look like forgiving the friend who betrayed you, the partner who disappointed you, the parent who failed you. Sometimes it's even forgiving yourself, because often the harshest chains we wear are forged from our own regrets. Letting go doesn't mean erasing memory. It means refusing to let memory become a prison. You can remember without being enslaved. You can acknowledge the pain without carrying it into every tomorrow. And here's the hidden gift. When you let go, your heart makes space. Space for compassion, space for love, space for joy that resentment once crowded out. Forgiveness is not the end of feeling, it is the beginning of feeling deeply again without distortion. Picture a pond disturbed by stones. The water ripples, muddy, unclear. But when the stones stop, the water slowly settles, becoming clear again. That is the heart when it lets go. Clarity returns, peace returns, and from that peace grows understanding. You begin to see that the person who hurt you was also suffering, trapped in their own ignorance, fear, or pain. You begin to see that life is too short to spend chained to old shadows. You begin to live again. This is the wisdom of Buddhism. Suffering is real, but it is not permanent. Pain arises, but it also passes. The more tightly you hold it, the longer it lingers. The moment you release it, you discover a freedom that was always waiting within. So the question becomes, what are you willing to release today? What burden can you finally put down? Because until we learn this wisdom, forgiveness seems impossible. But with it, forgiveness becomes the most natural act in the world. The act of aligning ourselves with the way life truly is, ever changing, ever flowing, always moving forward. And in that movement, we begin to see forgiveness not as weakness, but as strength. So many people think forgiveness is a sign of weakness. They imagine that to forgive is to bow down, to surrender, to erase justice. They say, if I forgive, it means I've lost. If I forgive, it means they win. But ask yourself, is it really weak to open your heart when everything in you wants to stay closed? Is it really weak to put down anger when carrying it feels easier? Or is it the greatest act of courage? In truth, forgiveness is not weakness. It is strength, because it takes far more power to release than to cling. Anyone can feed anger. Anyone can hold a grudge. That takes no effort. But to rise above anger, to look at pain and still choose compassion, that requires a strength that resentment will never know. Think of a raging fire. Anyone can throw wood into it, watch the flames grow, and feel powerful. But real mastery is not feeding the fire. It is calming it, controlling it, transforming it. Forgiveness is that mastery. Let me tell you a story from the time of the Buddha. There was once a man named Angulimala. His name means garland of fingers, because he was a feared bandit who murdered travelers and wore the fingers of his victims around his neck. Entire villages trembled at the sound of his name. One day, Angulimala crossed paths with the Buddha. Determined to add one more victim, he chased after him. But strangely, no matter how fast he ran, the Buddha always seemed to walk calmly ahead. Finally, exhausted, Angulimala shouted, "Stop, monk." The Buddha turned and said, "I have already stopped. It is you who must stop." Something in those words pierced through Angulimala's rage. For the first time, he saw himself clearly trapped in hatred, enslaved by violence. In that moment, he laid down his weapon and begged the Buddha to guide him. He became a monk and eventually an enlightened one. Now, imagine if the Buddha had responded with fear or hatred. Imagine if he had cursed Angulimala, condemned him as beyond redemption. Angulimala would have continued his violence. Instead, the Buddha forgave, and that forgiveness transformed a murderer into a saint. This is the strength of forgiveness. It does not deny justice. It does not erase responsibility, but it creates the possibility of transformation, both for others and for ourselves. When you forgive, you break the cycle of harm, because anger always wants to reproduce itself. Hurt people, but when forgiveness enters, the chain is broken. That's not weakness, that's power. Now think about your own life. Maybe someone betrayed you, insulted you, abandoned you. Maybe they don't deserve your forgiveness, but here's the truth. Forgiveness is not about deserving. It's about freeing yourself from the role of victim. It's about stepping into your own strength, saying, "You may have hurt me once, but you will not control me forever." And remember, forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean ignoring what happened. It doesn't mean inviting someone back into your life if they are toxic. True forgiveness simply means you refuse to let hatred be the ruler of your heart. That takes more strength than clinging to anger ever will. Think of the strongest people you've met. Are they the ones who explode at every insult? Are they the ones who hold grudges for decades? Or are they the ones who remain calm in the storm, who can look into the eyes of pain and still smile with compassion? Forgiveness is inner strength. It is emotional resilience. It is the proof that your spirit is not broken by what happened. In Buddhism, this strength comes from compassion. When you see the suffering in the one who harmed you, when you recognize their ignorance, their fear, their blindness, forgiveness arises naturally. You realize they acted not from true power, but from weakness. And by forgiving, you show that you are stronger than the weakness that drove them. There is a saying, "The weak can never forgive. Forgiveness is the attribute of the strong." And nowhere is this truer than in the human heart. So the next time you hesitate to forgive, remember this. Forgiveness is not about letting someone else win. It is about letting yourself rise. It is about reclaiming your strength, your peace, your freedom. And in that freedom, healing begins. Because forgiveness is not only an act of courage, it is a gift to the one who forgives. It is the beginning of mending the wounds we carry inside. Forgiveness is often spoken of as something we give to others. We imagine it as a gift to the one who hurt us, a pardon, a release. But in truth, the first and greatest recipient of forgiveness is ourselves. Because every time we hold a grudge, every time we replay an old wound, it is our own heart that bleeds. The person who harmed us may be far away. They may have forgotten. They may never apologize. But we are still carrying the cut inside, still reopening it day after day. Forgiveness is not letting them off the hook. Forgiveness is taking the hook out of your own heart. Imagine walking with a thorn stuck deep in your foot. At first you limp, but keep moving, convincing yourself you can manage. Days pass, weeks pass, and the wound festers. Every step is pain. Then one day you finally kneel, pull out the thorn, and bandage the wound. That moment of relief is forgiveness. It is healing the wound you've been carrying far too long. This is why forgiveness is called the first gift to oneself. It is the act of choosing peace over pain, freedom over chains. And here's a truth we often forget. Healing does not come from time alone. Time may dull the memory, but unless we forgive, the wound stays buried, waiting to rise again. How many people have snapped at loved ones, mistrusted new friends, or sabotaged relationships, all because of an old scar never healed? Forgiveness is what stops the wound from ruling your future. The Buddha once said, "You yourself, as much as anybody in the entire universe, deserve your love and affection." Forgiveness is one way we give ourselves that love, not by pretending nothing happened, but by saying, "I will not let this pain define me. I choose to heal." And sometimes, the hardest forgiveness is not toward others, but toward ourselves. How many nights have you replayed your own mistakes? The words you wish you hadn't said, the choices you wish you hadn't made, the failures that haunt you. Self-forgiveness can feel impossible. We punish ourselves far longer than necessary, as if holding on to guilt is proof of our goodness. But guilt, when clung to, becomes another prison. Self-forgiveness is not denial. It is acknowledging our humanity, learning, and allowing ourselves to begin again. Think of a child learning to walk. They stumble, they fall, they cry. But no parent scolds them for falling. The parent smiles, lifts them, and encourages them to try again. Why should we treat our own hearts with less compassion than we would a child's? Forgiving yourself is the first step to living fully again. And as we heal, something remarkable happens. The heart becomes lighter. The nights become softer. The mornings become brighter. Forgiveness clears away the smoke so we can breathe freely again. But let's be clear, healing is not instant. Forgiveness is a practice like tending a garden. At first, weeds of resentment keep returning. But with patience, kindness, and mindfulness, the garden of the heart begins to flourish. Each act of forgiveness, no matter how small, is a seed of healing. Forgiving the driver who cut you off in traffic. Forgiving the colleague who spoke harshly. Forgiving your own slip-ups, your own imperfections. Each seed adds up until the heart becomes a place of refuge, not a battlefield. And the beauty of this healing is that it radiates outward. When you forgive and heal, you carry less bitterness into the world. Your relationships soften. Your presence becomes calmer. People feel safer around you. Forgiveness given to yourself ripples outward, touching others without a word. So take a moment right now. Place a hand over your heart. Feel its steady beat. This heart has carried you through every storm, every wound, every sorrow. Doesn't it deserve the gift of forgiveness? Doesn't it deserve to rest? Forgiveness is not just an act. It is a form of self-care. It is choosing to unclench the fist, to breathe, to live with openness instead of armor. And when you do, you discover something astonishing. What once felt unbearable no longer holds power over you. The wound that once defined you becomes just a scar, and scars are proof not of weakness, but of healing. So remember this. The first gift of forgiveness is not to the one who hurt you. It is to yourself. It is the medicine your soul has been longing for. And from that healing, something even greater begins to grow: compassion. The ability to look at others, even those who wounded you, and see not just the harm they caused, but the suffering that drove them there. When the heart has begun to heal, something beautiful awakens within it: compassion. Forgiveness, after all, is not only about releasing yourself. It also opens your eyes to the suffering of others, the pain that often lies hidden behind their actions. Think of the last time someone hurt you. Maybe they spoke cruelly, maybe they betrayed you, maybe they treated you with indifference. The instinct is to see only the wound they gave you. But step closer, and you may notice something else. People who hurt others are almost always hurting themselves. Anger, cruelty, dishonesty, these are not signs of strength. They are signs of wounds left untended, fears left unspoken, traumas carried in silence. A person who lashes out is often someone who cannot bear the storm inside them. The Buddha taught that all beings seek happiness and all beings wish to avoid suffering. But when blinded by ignorance, fear, or desire, people act in ways that create more suffering for themselves and for those around them. When we begin to see this truth, forgiveness grows naturally, not as a duty but as compassion in action. Picture this. A child throws a tantrum, screaming and kicking. Do we see them as evil? No, we see a child overwhelmed by emotions too big for their little body. We hold them with patience until the storm passes. Now imagine that the adult who hurt you is also a child inside, carrying burdens they never learned how to release. Can you see them not as a monster, but as a fellow human being lost in their suffering? This shift in perception changes everything. Instead of feeding hatred, we begin to cultivate empathy. And empathy does not excuse wrongdoing, but it does free us from the endless cycle of vengeance. Compassion in action means looking at the person who wounded you and asking, what pain were they carrying that made them act this way? Sometimes the answer is clear: an abusive past, a history of neglect, an environment of fear. Sometimes the answer is hidden, known only to them, but the act of asking already begins to transform your heart. And compassion, when practiced deeply, is not passive, it is active. It's not only about understanding, but also about choosing a response that reduces suffering instead of multiplying it. A harsh word can be met with silence instead of retaliation. A betrayal can be met with clarity instead of revenge. A mistake can be met with guidance instead of condemnation. This is compassion in action. It is choosing to break the cycle. But let us be honest, compassion is not easy. When you are hurt, your first instinct is to protect, to strike back. Compassion asks you to see beyond the wound, to respond not from your pain but from your wisdom, and that takes courage. The Dalai Lama once said, "If you want others to be happy, practice compassion. If you want to be happy, practice compassion." Notice how he places happiness on both sides. Compassion does not only heal others, it heals you. By seeing the suffering of others, you no longer carry the poison of hatred in your veins. There is a story from Buddhist tradition. A man once insulted the Buddha, shouting words filled with anger and contempt. The Buddha listened calmly and then asked, "If someone offers you a gift and you choose not to accept it, to whom does the gift belong?" The man replied, "It belongs to the one who offered it." The Buddha smiled gently. "Then I do not accept your anger, it remains with you." This is compassion in action, to recognize that anger comes from suffering and to refuse to add more fuel to it. Compassion is not weakness. It is strength in its highest form. It requires discipline to meet cruelty with clarity, to meet ignorance with patience, to meet harm with understanding. It is the strength of one who has healed their own wounds enough to see beyond themselves. And when compassion blossoms, forgiveness follows like a shadow. Not because you force it, but because you no longer wish to carry hatred when you can carry love. Take a moment to reflect. Who in your life may have hurt you but was themselves hurting? Can you look at them even from afar and see their humanity? Can you acknowledge their suffering without condoning their actions? This is the doorway to deep forgiveness. And once this doorway opens, something even more transformative becomes possible. Reconciliation, not always with others but with life itself. Because compassion does not stop at those who harmed you. It expands outward, touching strangers, loved ones, even yourself, until the boundary between me and them begins to fade. This is where the practice deepens. Forgiveness becomes more than an act. It becomes a way of living, a way of moving through the world with a heart that sees suffering, and instead of recoiling, leans in with gentleness. Forgiveness is beautiful in theory, but let's be honest, it's one of the hardest things to practice. It sounds simple, just let go. Yet when you carry deep wounds, the very idea feels impossible. So how do we move from understanding forgiveness with our minds to actually living it with our hearts? The Buddha often compared practice to walking a path. You don't leap to the end in one stride. You take step after step, slowly, steadily. Forgiveness is no different. It is not a single act. It is a journey, and every journey begins with the first step. The first step is acknowledging the wound. Many people try to skip this. They say, "I don't care. It doesn't matter. I've already moved on." But denial is not forgiveness. Suppressed pain lingers in the shadows of your heart and shapes your life in ways you may not even realize. To forgive, you must first be honest. Yes, I was hurt. Yes, this wound is real. Only then can healing begin. The second step is allowing yourself to feel. Forgiveness does not mean pretending you are not angry, sad, or betrayed. It means giving yourself permission to feel the storm inside without letting it control you. Cry if you must. Write your feelings down. Sit quietly and breathe into the ache. In Buddhist meditation, we call this mindful awareness, being with your pain without judgment, without running away. The third step is shifting perspective. Ask yourself, what might have driven this person to act in such a way? Maybe it was fear, ignorance, insecurity. This does not excuse their behavior, but it helps loosen the chains of resentment. Remember, people who wound others often carry wounds themselves. Seeing this truth opens the door to compassion. The fourth step is choosing release. Forgiveness is not a feeling, it is a decision. A conscious choice to no longer let someone else's actions control your peace. Sometimes this means you reconcile with them. Other times it means you forgive silently in your heart, even if they never apologize. You do it not for them, but for yourself. The fifth step is practicing patience. Forgiveness rarely happens overnight. Some wounds are deep and need time. Like tending a garden, you water the seed of forgiveness with small acts each day, through meditation, prayer, or simply repeating to yourself, I choose to let go. Over time, what once felt impossible begins to feel natural. And finally, the sixth step, offering compassion. This doesn't mean letting harmful people back into your life, but it does mean wishing them freedom from suffering. You may whisper a quiet prayer. May you be free from the pain that caused you to harm me. May you find peace. In that simple act, your heart expands. You become bigger than your wound. One powerful Buddhist practice for this is metta meditation, also known as loving kindness meditation. You begin by wishing yourself peace. May I be happy. May I be safe. May I be free from suffering. Then you extend the same wish to someone you love, then to a neutral person, then slowly even to the one who hurt you. This practice softens the sharp edges of resentment until they no longer cut you from within. Forgiveness is not about forgetting. It's not about pretending the harm never happened. It's about releasing the hold it has on your life. Think of it like setting down a heavy stone you've been carrying for years. The weight was real, the journey was hard, but now your hands are free. Sometimes forgiveness requires boundaries. You may forgive someone and still choose not to allow them back into your life. That is not bitterness, it is wisdom. Forgiveness is about letting go of anger, not about keeping yourself in harm's way. So if you're listening right now, wondering how to begin, start small. Start with honesty. Start with one breath. Start with the intention, I don't want to suffer from this pain anymore. Even the smallest step in the right direction is progress. And here's the miracle. Each act of forgiveness doesn't just heal you, it ripples outward. It changes how you treat others, how you move through the world, how you raise your children, how you touch your community. Forgiveness multiplies like a candle that lights another without losing its own flame. So take the first step, however small, because every step toward forgiveness is a step toward freedom. And as this journey unfolds, you'll begin to notice something profound. Forgiveness doesn't only transform you, it transforms the world around you. Forgiveness is not only a personal act, it is also deeply social. Every one of us lives in a web of relationships, with our families, our partners, our friends, our co-workers, even strangers we brush past on the street. Within this web, countless small and large wounds are exchanged. Words spoken in anger, promises broken, trust betrayed. And in today's world where life moves faster than ever, those wounds often cut deeper. Modern life has made us more connected through technology, yet more disconnected in spirit. A careless comment online can spark years of resentment. A misunderstanding at work can poison a team. A betrayal in love can harden a heart for decades. The past clings to us, and suddenly we are not only living today, we are dragging yesterday everywhere we go. But here's the truth. Without forgiveness, relationships cannot survive. Families crumble, friendships dissolve, communities fracture. Even nations remain locked in cycles of revenge. Forgiveness, then, is not a luxury. It is the glue that holds humanity together. Think of family. Parents sometimes carry expectations that weigh heavily on children. Children, in turn, may resent their parents for what they did or failed to do. Brothers and sisters may fight over words said long ago, while years slip by, silent and cold. How many families are torn apart, not because the wound was too deep, but because no one was willing to forgive or consider love? In intimate relationships, forgiveness is the quiet power that allows two imperfect souls to grow together. Without it, every mistake becomes a brick in a wall that separates hearts. With it, the wall crumbles and love breathes again. To forgive your partner does not mean ignoring harm. It means recognizing that both of you are human, both capable of failure, both capable of change. And what about society at large? History is filled with violence, oppression, and injustice. Entire nations carry wounds passed from one generation to the next. Grudges become identities. We versus them. Yet when forgiveness is chosen, something miraculous happens. Think of South Africa, where the Truth and Reconciliation Commission invited both victims and perpetrators to speak, to be heard, and though it was never easy to forgive, it did not erase the past, but it prevented endless cycles of vengeance. Forgiveness became a foundation for healing, even for a wounded nation. In Buddhism, there is a deep teaching. Holding anger is like grasping a hot coal. You burn only yourself. This is true not only for the individual, but also for entire communities. When a society clings to resentment, it cannot move forward. Forgiveness, then, is not weakness. It is collective strength. It is how humanity evolves. But how do we practice forgiveness in modern life, where old wounds are constantly reopened? The answer is both simple and challenging. We must practice daily in small ways. When someone cuts you off in traffic, instead of cursing, take a breath and let it go. When your coworker fails you, remember they may be carrying burdens you cannot see. When your spouse or friend disappoints you, choose patience over punishment. Every act of forgiveness in daily life is a training for the greater acts of forgiveness that may one day be required of you. Of course, forgiveness in society does not mean ignoring justice. It does not mean tolerating abuse. A parent forgiving a child does not excuse harmful behavior. A victim forgiving a criminal does not erase accountability. Forgiveness and justice can walk hand in hand. Forgiveness liberates the heart, justice protects the world. Together they create balance. And here lies the beauty. Forgiveness has a ripple effect. When you forgive, you change the tone of your family. When families forgive, communities shift. When communities forgive, nations heal. And when nations heal, humanity moves closer to peace. Modern life often tells us to seek revenge, to cancel, to cut off. But true wisdom whispers another path: release, restore, renew. Forgiveness is the medicine that modern society, with all its wounds, desperately needs. So the next time you feel the sting of betrayal or the bitterness of injustice, pause. Ask yourself, what future do I want to create? One chained to the past, or one free to breathe? Because when forgiveness enters relationships and society, old wounds no longer define us. Instead, they become the soil from which compassion grows. And in that soil, something new is always waiting to bloom. Forgiveness is often spoken of as a moral act, a kindness to others, a healing for relationships. But in Buddhism, forgiveness is far more than that. It is not merely an ethical gesture. It is a profound spiritual practice, a stepping stone on the path to enlightenment. Why? Because forgiveness dissolves the very barriers that keep us trapped in suffering. When the Buddha spoke of enlightenment, he did not describe it as gaining something new. He described it as removing the veils that obscure what has always been within us: clarity, compassion, and freedom. Those veils are built from ignorance, attachment, and aversion. And what is resentment if not a mixture of all three? Think of resentment. It clings to the past, attaches to identity, and blinds us with anger. It tells us, I was wronged and I must carry this wound forever. But forgiveness says, I release this chain. I choose freedom over bitterness. In that moment, the mind lets go of illusion and moves closer to truth. In Buddhist teachings, there is a concept called metta, or loving kindness. It is the practice of radiating goodwill to all beings without exception. To truly embody metta, one must forgive. For how can you wish happiness for others if you still cling to hatred? Forgiveness clears the soil, so loving kindness can take root. There is also karuna, compassion. Compassion arises naturally when you see that every being suffers, even those who cause harm. To forgive is to see the suffering behind another's actions, not to excuse them, but to recognize that anger only multiplies suffering while compassion can end it. And then there is awaken, equanimity, the deep balance of a mind that is free. Forgiveness is the training ground for equanimity. Every time you release a grudge, you train your mind to remain steady in the face of pain, no longer swayed by the storms of anger or revenge. Step by step, these qualities, metta, karuna, awaken, form the very heart of enlightenment, and forgiveness is the key that unlocks them. Imagine a monk sitting in meditation. The body is still, but the mind is restless. Memories rise, insults, betrayals, past pains. Each one is like a stone blocking the flow of stillness. The monk breathes deeply and whispers within, "I forgive." Slowly, the stones dissolve. The river flows clear. This is not just peace, it is awakening. And forgiveness is not only for monks or mystics in distant caves, it is for you here and now. Every act of forgiveness you choose is a small awakening. When you forgive your friend, you awaken to patience. When you forgive your parents, you awaken to compassion. When you forgive yourself, you awaken to love. These awakenings, though small, are fragments of enlightenment shining through. The Buddha once said, "Hatred does not cease by hatred, but only by love." This is the eternal law. Forgiveness is how that eternal law is lived. Each time you forgive, you turn away from the endless cycle of samsara, the wheel of anger, revenge, and suffering, and step onto the path of liberation. But perhaps the deepest teaching is this: forgiveness is not something you do, it is something you realize. When you truly see that clinging to anger only hurts yourself, forgiveness is the natural response. When you see that all beings are bound by ignorance, forgiveness flows as naturally as breathing. It is not forced, it is not contrived, it is the mind awakening to truth. And in that awakening, the self itself begins to dissolve. For who is it that clings to anger, the ego? Who is it that says, "I was wronged, I demand repayment"? The self-image we hold so tightly. Forgiveness cracks that image, showing us that the self is not as solid as we believe. In letting go of resentment, we are also letting go of the illusion of self. This is why forgiveness is not weakness, it is wisdom. It is the wisdom of impermanence, knowing that no pain, no insult, no wound is permanent. It is the wisdom of interbeing, knowing that the one who harmed you is also trapped in suffering. It is the wisdom of non-self, knowing that the story of me versus you is but a dream. And when forgiveness becomes complete, something extraordinary happens. The heart is no longer a battlefield. It becomes vast, spacious, open. It can embrace friend and enemy alike. It can embrace the whole world. And in that embrace, enlightenment is not far away. So when you struggle to forgive, remember, you are not just healing a wound, you are walking the path to awakening. Every act of release is a step toward freedom. Every moment of letting go is a glimpse of nirvana. And perhaps one day in the silence of your own heart, you will discover what the Buddha discovered, that when forgiveness is complete, nothing remains to bind you. The chains are gone. Only freedom remains. Forgiveness is not the end of the journey. It is the door that opens into freedom. For so long, many of us have carried heavy chains, resentment, anger, wounds that never seemed to heal. We thought that by holding on, we were protecting ourselves. But what we've discovered is the opposite. We were only prolonging our suffering. To forgive is to finally lay those chains down. It is to say, "I will not let the past decide the rest of my life." Forgiveness does not erase the story. It transforms it. The wound becomes wisdom. The pain becomes compassion. The one who was once your enemy becomes your teacher. And in that transformation, you are no longer a prisoner. You are free, free to love without fear, free to live without bitterness, free to walk the path of awakening with a heart that is light, unburdened, open. This freedom is not distant. It is here in this very breath, waiting for you to claim it. The question is not, can I forgive? The real question is, am I ready to be free? Because forgiveness is not a gift to someone else, it is the gift you give yourself. It is the choice to stop drinking poison. It is the courage to live fully. It is the wisdom to let go. So now, as this journey draws to a close, remember this. The world does not need more anger. It needs more hearts that are willing to forgive. And perhaps, if you begin with your own heart, you will find that you have already taken the first step in healing not just yourself, but the world. Forgive and live. If these words have touched you, take them with you. Reflect on them. Practice them. And if you feel this message belongs not just to you but to the world, then let's continue this journey together. Here, on Zen Buddhism Wisdom, we share teachings that light the path, stories that heal the heart, and insights that remind us who we truly are. If this resonated with you, I invite you, gently, sincerely, to subscribe so you won't miss what comes next. Share this with someone who may need forgiveness in their life. And let us walk this path of wisdom, compassion, and freedom, side by side.